Welcome back. This is our World History SOL 11 Rise of Dictators lecture. And so what we're looking at is the rise of dictators in the interwar period, that is the period between World Wars I and II. All right, so following World War I, there were major disruptions. We had new governments. There were economic disruptions. There were very unstable political conditions. There's a global depression in the 1930s. Okay, and these things give opportunities. They provide vacuums for the rise of dictators. Essentially, what you're looking at is that people are desperate, they're poor, they don't have roofs over their heads or food in their bellies, and so they're more willing to accept the unacceptable, which means people like Hitler and Mussolini are able to, rise to power, Franco in Spain, etc. So in the Soviet Union, we're going to see the rise of Joseph Stalin. All right. Under Lenin, we saw communism take hold. Remember, we talked about the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that brought them out of World War I and installed communism. Lenin is succeeded by Stalin. Stalin will become a ruthless dictator. He wanted to create a perfect communist state and then transform it into a totalitarian state. To be clear, Stalin was not like a Karl Marx victory to the proletariat, champion of the working class kind of leader. Stalin was a Stalinist. Okay, Stalin was, wanted to create a cult of personality around himself and wanted to exercise absolute power. All right. So he was a Stalinist. He wanted his government to have total control over every aspect of public and private life. All right. So Stalin has a secret police called the KGB, and their job is to maintain power. All right. Stalin's secret police, the KGB, monitored telephone lines. They read mail. They had informers. People were encouraged to inform on their neighbors. Even children told authorities disloyal remarks they heard in their homes. So children would report parents. Families lived in constant fear of the KGB. All right. And then Stalin initiates the Great Purge, which begins in 1937. This is a campaign of terror designed to eliminate anyone who threatens Stalin's grip on power. So we think that Stalin is responsible for between 8 and 13 million deaths in his effort to win total control of the Soviet state. And you might remember I mentioned in our previous lecture that the military is included in this. And during the purge, Stalin kills tens of thousands of military officers. So in a short period of time, Russia is going to find itself once again at war with Germany. And it's going to be at a great disadvantage because its officer corps is going to have been executed by Stalin because of his paranoia. All right, and you can see it's a grainy photo, but this is it's a mass execution. Millions of people executed, sent to gulags to work until their deaths during the Great Purge. Stalin institutes a 5-year plan. Remember that under the communist system of government in the Soviet Union, it's all centrally planned. They don't rely on the market to allocate resources. So he says he wants to stimulate and develop the economy into an industrial revolution. He wants to force Russia to industrialize. All right, the problem is they have a very large population that's mostly agricultural. And so if you're going to try to forcibly industrialize a rural population, you're going to run into some troubles, all right, like severe shortages of housing, food, and clothing. So Stalin sets high quotas. He wants to increase the output of steel, coal, oil, and electricity at the expense of more basic needs like housing, food, and clothing. So he's lowering the production of consumer goods because he wants to modernize Russia. Russia does make substantial gains, so they don't achieve these goals, and these gains are made at the expense of the Soviet people. People are starving. There are housing shortages. Their standard of living goes down. So this is going to be a bad thing for the Russian people. All right. Um, Collectivization of farms occurs under Stalin. This is where, like I mentioned in our previous lecture, that farms are going to be run in a communistic kind of way, in which they are collectively owned. Okay, so all farms are seized by the government. 25 million privately owned farms starting in 1928, and these will become large government-owned farms. The idea is to produce food for the state, just like the factories. They're state-owned, collectively owned. Well, this is going to be very inefficient, and it's going to result in major grain shortages. All right, remember that Stalin came to power through communism, the entrenchment of communism. Okay, he institutes a 5-year plan to try to modernize Russia, collectivizes farming that's going to result in grain shortages. He's going to try to industrialize Russia, but this is going to happen at the expense of the Soviet people. He institutes a secret police force called the KGB to root out dissent. And he institutes the Great Purge, in which he kills or imprisons 8 to 13 million people, including much of his army's officer corps. Stalin, by the 1930s, had forcibly transformed the Soviet Union into a totalitarian regime. That's where he had absolute power, and it is an industrial power. All right, and Russia will be a major industrial power. During World War II, their industry is going to outproduce the Germans, and that's going to help them win the war. But it came at a cost. He was unopposed as a dictator. He ruled through fear. All right, he didn't tolerate creativity. He saw it as a threat to conformity. Obedience was what was most important. He exercised total social control. He ruled by terror. So there was no freedom of speech, religion, press. You were not allowed to criticize Stalin. In fact, criticizing Stalin was the last thing you would want to do, because any sort of affront to Stalin could have been deadly. And actually, there's an instance where there was a dinner party, and the waiter actually spilled a little bit of red wine on Stalin's white suit, and the whole room froze. And after a few minutes, Stalin kind of just, basically Stalin acted like he didn't notice and went back to eating. But everybody stopped because they were waiting to see if Stalin would have that waiter killed for spilling a little bit of wine on him. So Stalin ruled through terror in all things. A communist dictatorship was established by Vladimir Lenin and continued by Stalin in the Soviet Union. We've discussed this. Now in Italy, all right, we're going to get fascism under Benito Mussolini, all right, also known as El Duce. All right, he's kind of a character. All right, we'll get into him. But Mussolini is going to institute a fascist regime. So people lost faith in democracies after the Great Depression. We kind of take capitalism and democracy for granted, but during the Great Depression, things were pretty bad. And so there were people that sort of thought that democracy had failed, and they were looking for alternatives because they were starving and desperate. So they began to turn to an extreme system of government known as fascism. Fascism is a very extreme form of nationalism. Remember nationalism, national pride, belief in your nation as superior. Well, fascism is like the extreme form of nationalism, a very dangerous form of nationalism. Fascists promise to revive the economy, to punish those responsible for hard times, and restore order and national pride. Guess, by the way, who they end up saying is responsible for the hard times in these fascist states? Usually the most vulnerable people. So, for example, in fascist Germany, it's going to be Jewish people, Polish people, Slavic people who are going to be blamed for the hard times. In Italy, it's going to be along the same lines. And so they're going to blame ethnic minorities for the struggles of their countries, and that is going to result in some tragedy, like the Holocaust. All right, fascism is militant, all right, and it emphasizes loyalty to the state and obedience to rulers. Okay, it's dangerous stuff. Founded by the Fascist Party in 1919, Benito Mussolini promised to rescue Italy by reviving the economy and rebuilding the military. His followers wore black shirts. They're called the black shirts. On October 22nd, 1922, Mussolini and his supporters forced King Victor Emmanuel III to put Mussolini in charge. So Mussolini's demands were granted without any fuss. He became known as El Duce, or the leader. He abolished democracy. He outlawed all political parties, and he created a secret police to kill his opponents. He planned to recreate the old Roman Empire. There's that nationalism that he's campaigning on. His ambition is to restore the glory of Rome. Mussolini said, "We're going to turn the Mediterranean into an Italian lake." Right? And this appealed to the nationalistic sentiments of Italian people, this idea of restoring the glory of the old Roman Empire. And so he's going to invade Ethiopia. Remember, we talked about the Battle of Adwa, where the Ethiopians crushed the Italians. Well, the Ethiopians are going to have another go at it, and they're going to struggle, and ultimately they're going to use chemical weapons to subjugate Ethiopian forces, but they're still only going to manage to occupy Ethiopia for a relatively short period of time. Ethiopia will continue to fight a war of resistance and will become independent again when Italy is defeated. So Mussolini came to power because of the rise of fascism and his ambition to restore the glory of Rome. His invasion of Ethiopia satisfied nationalistic sentiments. Basically, it appealed to this idea that, well, hey, we're going to turn the Mediterranean into an Italian lake. Mussolini also, like, if you ever see him speak, he looks a little ridiculous, kind of like an actor. Mussolini was actually like a really big fan of an Italian actor named Machista. And Machista kind of sounds like macho or machismo. Machista was just like an Italian actor whose claim to fame was just to kind of act like quote unquote manly. And so, like, basically, whenever Mussolini spoke in public, he tried to just act like Machista. And so he would act really tough. A lot of times he would, like go skiing shirtless, or, just generally things that he felt made him look like a big tough guy. So that's Mussolini for you. All right. Japan will also see a rise of dictatorship and a rise in militarism. All right. So in 1920s, Japan was one of the democratic nations. They signed a treaty respecting Chinese borders. They renounced war in 1928 under the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And as long as everything stayed peaceful and prosperous, the civilian government kept power. But things are going to change. All right, the Great Depression, like I said, is going to put democracies to the test. Civilians blame democratic government for their problems. Military leaders gained control. The emperor became a symbol of state power. Where does this sort of sound familiar, right? Think back to some of the European states that we've talked about so far where we saw the same thing happen. All right. And the emperor will be eventually elevated to the height of a deity. So the Japanese will almost look at Emperor Hirohito the way Western Christians look at Jesus. The principal military leader, Hideki Tojo, will lead Japan down the path of militarism and expansion, and Hirohito will follow. Okay, here is Hideki Tojo. This is Emperor Hirohito. You can see he's very young. All right, he's like a deity to the Japanese people. So, like I said in a previous lecture, if you remember Commodore Perry and the Black Ships and that national humiliation where Japan was forced to trade, Japan sees an end to the Tokugawa shogunate and basically an emergence of sort of a desire to modernize and industrialize, and Japan kind of bursts onto the world scene as a powerful state. So Japan is industrializing rapidly. They do a really good job at sending folks out to various European countries and to the United States, and learning modern naval warfare doctrine, modern land warfare doctrine. They seek out, people to come to Japan and introduce, railroads and things like that. So Japan becomes sort of a very rapidly growing economy, rapidly industrializing. The only issue that they're going to run into is that the Japanese islands are volcanic islands. And so they have very limited natural resources. The raw materials needed for industrialization, coal, iron, that kind of thing, or rubber, are limited on the Japanese homeland. So they have to expand, all right? And in order to do that, they're going to need to conquer their neighbors. But this goes against some previous agreements that they've made. Okay, so military leaders in Japan focused on nationalism. They promised to help the economy by expanding Japanese borders. So they invade Manchuria. They won. They set up a puppet government. This directly challenges the League of Nations. All right, but remember, the United States didn't join the League of Nations, and the nations of Europe, tired from the First World War, are not going to be able to stand up to this threat, especially with things going on simultaneously in Europe. All right, so China is next. There's a border dispute in 1937. The Japanese started a war with China, and northern China fell to the Japanese. The Japanese invasion of China is brutal. And they brutalized the Chinese population. There's a very infamous episode called the Rape of Nanking, in which tens of thousands of Chinese women are raped. And so the brutalization of China and Manchuria is going to lead the United States to impose sanctions against Japan. And actually, the United States imposes an embargo of oil and steel against Japan, which is going to worsen relations between the U.S. and Japan, and eventually, bring the two to war. They also invade Korea. So the Japanese have expanded considerably. They've built a major empire in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and they can now they've got the resources that they need. Now this is as of 1942. And what they're going to end up doing is launching a preemptive strike against the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in the hopes of taking the United States out of the war long enough for them to really use these raw materials to build up their military. And then their hope is that when the United States finally returns to the scene, we won't be willing to sacrifice the blood and treasure to take it all back. Basically, we'll let them keep what they've taken. We won't try to fight them to, give it up. All right, but more on that later. So Hideki Tojo is essentially the military ruler of Japan. Japan's government was largely controlled by the military, with the emperor sort of at their behest. So the military basically had the ear of the emperor. They had a lot of influence over the emperor. The emperor was sort of a deity to the Japanese people, and so the military used that to their advantage. The military was glorified. Militarism became sort of the standard in Japan, and Japan began to rapidly industrialize. So they needed raw materials, so they invaded Korea, Manchuria, and China. Okay. Japan emerged as a world power after World War I and continued its imperialistic policies in Asia. Moving on to Germany during the interwar period. Remember, Germany had been severely punished and forbidden from rebuilding its military, but it's not going to do that. All right. So Germany during the Great Depression is hit especially hard. To pay for wartime debt, the reparations that Germany had to pay, they had to print more money. But that means that they caused runaway inflation, and German money lost most of its value. German money was printed to finance reparations. And so just to give you an idea, German bread cost a mark in 1918. But it cost 160 marks in 1922. By 1923, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Talk about inflation. So German money is essentially worthless. Germans began to request or to really sort of question the Weimar Republic, which is the democratic government that has been set up in Germany. So Germany at this point is still a democracy, but it's falling apart. Hitler is going to use these problems to manipulate the German people, to scapegoat ethnic minorities, and to seize control. Hitler is never popularly elected. He uses a coup, the Reichstag fire, to seize control. So look at that. I mean, the German money is worthless. Stack it up all day. A German housewife burned money in 1923 since it was cheaper to burn marks than to burn firewood. And this is, stories like this are sometimes apocryphal, but I mean, it's true. The money was worthless. You might as well burn it to warm yourself because you can't even transport enough of it to buy a loaf of bread. Germany was somewhat able to recover thanks to the work of an American banker named Charles Dawes. His plan was to loan $200 million, stabilize German currency, and to strengthen its economy. And he set a more realistic schedule for Germany's reparation payments. And the loan helped to attract more loans and investments to slow inflation. So there were attempts to, stem the flow, but Adolf Hitler and Mussolini were bent on taking control. All right, in 1919 in Munich, Hitler joined a small right-wing political group called the Nazis. This is the National Socialist German Workers' Party. All right, and they start to develop a following. They believed that the Treaty of Versailles should be overturned, that they needed to prevent the spread of communism in Germany, and that they needed to set up a private militia called the Stormtroopers or Brown Shirts. These guys are going to end up helping destroy democracy. We're going to end up helping with the destruction of democracy, rather, in Germany in the 1930s. Hitler became the leader of the Nazi Party. He was inspired by Mussolini. Mussolini was sort of his sort of role model. He wanted to do the same thing in Munich that Mussolini did in Rome. Hitler's actually arrested for treason, though. And he attempts to, it's called the beer hall push, and he essentially attempts to seize power the same way Mussolini did in a popular uprising with his brown shirts, like Mussolini did with his black shirts. It doesn't quite work, though. Hitler is in prison for 5 years. He only served 9 months, though, because he was becoming increasingly influential and popular in Germany. All right. While he was in prison, he writes a book called Mein Kampf, which is German for My Struggle, where he set forth his goals for Germany. And he traffics in a pseudo history, a fake history, in which he says that Germans are the descendants of, an Aryan master race, so to speak, and that he says other races are inferior. And he said that basically that many of Germany's problems stem from those inferior races living in Germany and becoming influential in the German government and economy, and that the only way Germany could restore itself is by eliminating those inferior races and restoring German pride and elevating the master race. And this is all just made up. Essentially what Hitler's doing is an age-old formula, and that's there's minority groups, they're vulnerable, so blame the problems on them, and then he says, but don't worry, I'm the one who will take care of them. I'm going to protect you from these minorities, and I'm going to institute laws that favor the majority in the master race and all this kind of stuff. So he's using racism and ethnic hatred to get power. All right, he probably doesn't even believe all the stuff that he's preaching. He just knows that desperate Germans are going to buy into it, and he can use it to consolidate power. I also believe that Germans needed something called Lebensraum, which means living space. So he promised to get that space by conquering Eastern Europe and Russia, basically saying, hey, we need room to expand. I'm the guy that's going to get it. So in 1932, the Nazi Party becomes one of the largest parties in Germany. Hitler loses the popular election, but he's named chancellor. All right. And so what he ends up doing is he stages a fire at the Reichstag, at the Chancellery. And then he blames communists for the fire, and he uses it as an excuse to suspend civil liberties. And then his brown shirts, his stormtroopers go around. They say, "Oh, don't worry, we're going to keep you safe from the communists that are destroying, that burn the Reichstag, that are trying to take over." And so he basically stages all of this to seize power. And very quickly, democracy in Germany is destroyed. It becomes a totalitarian state. The Nazis control every aspect of public and private life. There is no more freedom of the press. The Nazis control the literature. They have a massive propaganda machine. Hitler glorifies himself and the Nazis. They even made like a film, and a Titanic film on a German lake, in which basically they blamed Jewish people for the sinking of the Titanic, and the hero in the film was a Nazi officer who warns everybody about the danger. So their propaganda machine is far-reaching in Germany. They burn books that don't conform to Nazi beliefs, and they warn church officials, "You better play along. Espouse Nazi ideology, or you're going to be in trouble." Like the other totalitarian states we've seen, they also form a secret police called the Gestapo, which will help and shock German citizens into submission. The Nazis took complete control over the economy. Hitler is able to eliminate unemployment by essentially putting all of the German citizens into the military, and then having them build armaments, build vehicles, military weapons, and do public works projects like highways and bridges and things like that. A lot of Hitler's ideology is predicated on anti-Semitism, which is hatred of Jewish people. This is a central part of Hitler's ideology. So remember, an important part of Hitler's ideology is scapegoating. So the Jewish people are a minority in Germany, so they're a vulnerable population. It's easy to blame them for Germany's troubles. So they become scapegoats. Basically, Hitler is giving Germans somebody to point the finger at. He blamed them for the Great Depression. All right. And so he uses this to sort of rally support. And he scapegoats Jewish people, Polish people, Slavic people, and the Nazis begin passing laws depriving Jewish people of most of their rights. Hitler is ready to get his living space, his Lebensraum, and take back German territory. The first disregard for the Treaty of Versailles is to build up the military. So Hitler is going to start to rearm Germany. All right. At first, this is done kind of low-key, but soon Hitler just completely flaunts the Treaty of Versailles and begins a massive buildup. The League of Nations is not going to be able to stand up to this. Okay. Remember, the European countries are exhausted from World War I. They just can't imagine another great war, and the United States is out of it and isolationist again, so the League of Nations is going to fall flat on its face. On March 7th, 1936, Germany invades the Rhineland. This was a buffer zone between Germany and France. All right, this is clear aggression. Still, France and Britain are exhausted. They just can't imagine another great war, so they're going to try to appease Hitler. Newsflash, there's no appeasing Hitler. He wants to conquer Europe. Okay, so there's only one way this is going to go. But they're holding out hope that they can reach some kind of appeasement with Hitler and avoid war. All right, so Germany is expanding. German aggressions 1936 to 1939. There's a German expansion. All right, German expansion. They start to carve up territory. And then by the end of 1939, they're going to sign a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, and they're going to split Poland with the Soviets. And so Germany's going to invade, Russia's going to invade, they're going to split Poland between them. And that is going to begin World War II. 1939, World War II will begin in Europe. All right, the German reoccupation of the Rhineland is a turning point in his march toward war. Hitler gained confidence that conquering stuff would be easy. And he got more support by the people in Germany. So the balance of power will shift. And France and Belgium are now open to attack. On November 5th, 1937, Hitler creates the Third Reich, the Third German Empire. Remember the Second Reich we talked about? He's going to absorb Austria and Czechoslovakia. He annexes, lays claim to Austria. Now he's looking to the Czech Republic, where millions of, or Czechoslovakia, where millions of Germans lived in what is called the Sudetenland. The Czechs asked for France's help, all right, because this violates the Treaty of Versailles. All right, so how did Hitler come to power? Inflation and depression caused by those punishments laid out in the Treaty of Versailles. Democratic government was weakened because of the economic straits of, in Germany. Remember the money. It was cheaper to burn the money than to buy firewood. Extreme anti-Semitism. So Hitler capitalized on, there was already anti-Semitism in Europe. So there was already hostile feelings toward Jewish people because of anti-Semitism. So basically what Hitler did was just capitalize on some of the uglier aspects of humanity to come to power. And this has happened in the United States. People have used racism and ethnic hatred to get political power. It's a dangerous formula that we would do well to avoid. Extreme nationalism. All right, Hitler and Mussolini, said that they were going to restore pride. So Hitler said he was going to restore German pride. So he's appealing to nationalistic feelings. The rise of the National Socialists, as in Nazism, in Germany, and the German occupation of nearby countries. So the Treaty of Versailles worsened economic and political conditions in Europe and led to the rise of totalitarian regimes in Italy and Germany. All right, that concludes our interwar Rise of Dictators lecture. All right, make sure you guys do the discussion board, answer the chapter questions, and fill out those guided notes, and I will see you next time.